the moment our fellow geeks, dweebs, nerds, and other unfortunates have been fervently waiting for has finally arrived. It's time for TMI, Confessionals of the Nerd Kind. And now, your hosts, Jeff Nerf Herder Chandler, Jim Kaiju Baker, and Mike Mjolnir Evans. And now, let's get on with the show. Here is TMI.
That was like one of our longest episodes. He was like, that's because Jeff wouldn't shut up. That's when I'm like, all right, I gotta reevaluate my contribution to the show. I'm just gonna talk from the heart.
Always best.
Is that it?
I'm gonna spit the truth.
Yeah.
There you go.
2019, we're here.
2019, here we are. And I will have to say that I give kudos to this crew that we have continued. We have not missed one single week since we started this in April. Now we've had cast members come and go, drop off, got things going on, but the show has continued. So
Yeah, maybe this is going to be like a Menudo situation where
we just bring in new cast members.
Yeah, bring in new cast members, and they will eventually succeed us, and we'll be gone completely.
So who's Ricky Martin? Which one of us is Ricky Martin?
I was going to go with like Journey or Queen, but Menudo works too.
Menudo.
You know, if it was a Journey thing, we would be outsourcing from Taiwan or something.
There you go.
So for 2019, we're starting with a series of very special episodes. We're coming up with our very own TMI bucket list. And as you know, if you've been listening, we rate the movies that we talk about with a bucket system rather than a star system. 5 being the ultimate.
That's a lot of popcorn. By
0, I guess 0 being the worst. Mike has given a couple of zeros.
Aquaman.
No, I think you gave. Wow,
I
think
gave it
it's
a
an
1.
underwater theme.
Yeah, I gave it 1.5.
Yeah.
1.5.
And then,
I was feeling generous.
And then the Incredible Mr. Olympus. So you have like a negative underwater vibe.
I think that one was 0. I'm pretty sure that.
Yeah. No, you refused to watch it and you gave it a 0.
Yeah.
So the bucket list this is our rarefied 5 bucket category.
This is all 3 of us are in agreement.
Well, that's what I was going to say. It might be too much to ask all 3. At least a Democratic majority. Would we agree on this? Because I think if it had to be all 3, then we would never ever have another bucket list episode.
Maybe it is not going to be a very big list. I think. I mean,
well, if this was the case, then Into the Spider-Verse would make our bucket list.
As would Braveheart. I think Mike and I both gave Braveheart 5 buckets.
So I think that's only fair, right? 2 out of 3, a Democratic.
2 out of 3. All right.
2 out of 3. Okay.
The third one can be begrudgingly drawn along.
So I don't think there's any lobbying needed for our first bucket list film. Maybe a predictable choice, but we've never really discussed it at length. The only real Star Wars discussion that we've had at any length of time has been Solo. And then before that, we talked about The Last Jedi, the Blu-ray release of The Last Jedi. So we haven't really gone classic for any extended discussions, and we're going to rectify that today.
But this is a unanimous, right? We are all unanimous 5 buckets here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. 5 buckets.
If we're not, I might have to walk away.
This is Star Wars we're talking about.
The original, 1977.
Episode 4.
The New Hope.
Well, I mean, it's A New Hope now, but when I saw it, it wasn't called A New Hope.
Yes, I wanted to bring that up because I was 6 years old when I first saw this movie, when it was released in 1977. I remember being taken to the drive-in, and the only scene I remember from that first viewing was the Tusken Raider, the sand person.
Okay.
They're sand people, all right. I can see one of them now.
Who jumps up into Luke's binoculars and knocks him over. And that made enough of an impression on me that was the only thing I remembered from the first viewing. And I think I saw it proper in 1978 during the first re-release, and that was my first lasting memory of the whole movie, when I took everything in. But that first viewing, when I was 6 years old, I wouldn't have remembered what the credits look like, but reading some research on this film for this episode, yes, during its initial release, it did not have that subtitle, A New Hope, nor was it labeled Episode
4, right?
No.
The crawl
because
just
he was
said
lucky
Star
he
Wars.
got this. He's lucky he got this movie made at all, to be honest with you. So, but yeah, he had always intended it to be. He didn't want to start at the beginning and just tell you a tale from beginning to end. He wanted to start right in the middle, just like those old serials that he used to watch in the 40s and 50s as a kid, going in every week to the movie theater and just cliffhangers. Episode 7 of Flash Gordon or whatever. Well, that was his thought process behind it. And obviously, in pushing to get this through the studio, he kind of backed off. And I think initially, Empire and Star Wars were all considered in his first draft. Like that whole storyline existed in like the first movie treatment. And then obviously he pared it back significantly and just concentrated on this one little story.
And I read something this morning about how he initially wanted to remake Flash Gordon itself.
Couldn't get the rights.
Morphed into Star Wars as we know it today. Started to write it in the early 70s. 73, I think, is when he completed the first treatment of this. And
was it referred to as Journal of the Wilds?
Turned down by studio after studio.
Lots of them turned it down.
United Artists, Universal, Disney turned it down, which is kind of ironic since they
now own it
today. Yeah.
I guess they rectified that years later.
Well, what was Lucas known for? Was it really just American Graffiti?
American Graffiti. I mean, THX 1138, which was his student film, really kind of catapulted him into the spotlight. He was really kind of like the sub-director. He was really entrenched with Coppola, Scorsese. He knew a lot of these other guys.
It always struck me as odd that you go from American Graffiti to Star Wars.
It is a weird,
right?
American Graffiti, I think, is much more autobiographical of the time that he lived in and the hot rodding days and whatever. He spent a fair amount of time building this story. He was really entrenched with Joseph Campbell. He had a very famous book, that Many Faces of the Hero. If you go back to like Greek mythology and all these other stories and lores about the hero's journey, and he really picked and chose Luke's journey specifically for the original, really drew a lot from everything that he grew up with as a kid and just kind of cobbled it together and created this thing.
So let's talk about the phenomenon that Star Wars really sparked. And I know we kind of touched on this in our first ever episode. So I just revealed that, I was 6 years old when the first one came out. So it didn't make as much an impression on me as it did later on when I got a little bit older. Memories from you guys, the first time you saw it. Do you remember specifics?
Yeah, we were traveling cross country. We were like on a 6-week. My father had this notion how romantic it would be to travel in a Ford LTD2 cross country for 6 weeks. And so on our way back, we actually stopped in Illinois and saw it in a movie theater there. And of course, totally blown away. And that summer, I saw it 6, 7, 8 more times. Anytime we all went to the movies, I went and saw Star Wars.
And that's unbelievable. That blows my mind. Now, you were a couple years older, though, right, Mike? You were.
Yeah, I would have been 10.
Well, I will say I was 9 at the time. And I've always said this, and it's kind of embarrassing, but like this movie changed my life. 9 years old, my parents were going through a divorce. I had no knowledge or really any kind of, I didn't know what this was. I remember like in the local discount department store seeing T-shirts with what I now know is Han and Chewie, the old school iron-ons, and not knowing what it was. He just looked like a giant dog to me. But I was unaware whatsoever of the phenomenon of it. And my dad, who had remarried, and he had this whole other family, all of a sudden we go there one weekend and it's like, oh, we're going to take you to this movie to go, everyone's talking about it. I'm going to say it was probably late summer. It wasn't like right when the movie came out. I do remember we came in late. So I never saw the opening sequence scroll or the Star Destroyer coming across the screen until the 97 reissue. The special editions when it came out. I only saw this in the movie theater once, and that was it. Yes, I saw it once. When we walked into the theater, Vader was already on the floor of the Tantive, and like Jim, you said, the Tusken Raider kind of like blew you away. I remember coming out, and my mind was like jello because I couldn't even process what I had seen. But the one scene that really stuck with me was Luke and Leia swinging across the chasm. But from that moment, everything and anything in my life revolved around this movie. And if there's any of my friends who I was in high school or in middle school with, no, I drew these characters constantly. I got the trading cards. I had the the album, which was basically the movie. I mean, dialogue and music and everything. And it had a little booklet with little pictures in it. You know, that was it. I was just absolutely sucked into this universe. My mother, it probably was that Christmas I got like the first 6 figures plus it had to have been a year later because they didn't even come out
They only
until
had
70.
the empty box in 70.
So they didn't even come out until a year later. And I had the figures and then the land speeder, and it just took over my life. It really did. And it wasn't until years later when Dark Horse got the rights to print up Star Wars comic books or whatever, and you started reading these. That was back when they had newsletters in the back. People would actually write in, you know, hey, I love this book or whatever. And you started realizing that I wasn't alone. There was other people who actually felt the same way as I do. And now it's like so cliched to say that this movie changed your life, but it really did for me. For this little kid who had nothing to cling on to. All I wanted was to be Luke Skywalker with my own 2 robots. And I still have old school lined notebook pages with doodles of the characters that I've kept all these years. So
Instagram that.
Instagram. I should.
And it just wasn't us that was affected by this. The world went Star Wars crazy. That's a little bit hard to impart these days. Nothing really had come before like it. And that's really a cliche in itself. Any movie that comes out now is touted as being nothing. You've not seen anything like this before.
Or this generation Star Wars.
It was a true statement. And you really did not.
I hate to say it, but Lucas didn't even have faith in it. He ran. Him and Spielberg went to Hawaii on the opening weekend because he just didn't want it. He did a screening for all of his studio buddies or whatever. And I don't even think they had the proper footage yet of the big battle at the end. He had just sliced in some World War II battle footage. And when the screening was over, it was dead silence. Like even his peers were just like, I don't know what to even make of this. So, I mean, and it could have been just the biggest bomb in the world.
Steven Spielberg at the time was making Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And George Lucas was convinced that Close Encounters was going to completely outshine Star Wars, and Spielberg thought the opposite. So they made a pact where they both agreed to give each other 2.5% of the royalties of each other's movies.
And Lucas had very little to play with to begin with because he gave away almost all of his rights just to get this made. I mean, he was completely over budget. I mean, ILM... They were making up. I mean, this is what makes me mad about the 97 reissue.
Over my dead body.
Yes,
I bet you have.
When they went back, and so that's fine. He always said it's like a painting. You know, art is never finished; it's simply abandoned. And so he went back. He now had the money, the resources, and the clout to say, this is only about 70% of what I wanted this movie to be. And so I'm going to go back and I'm going to tweak it. But he tweaked it to the point where he negated a lot of the John Dyksters who created these cameras to shoot these models. And now just because we can do it in CG doesn't mean that you do that. You're taking away all of the work that came into this. And so this is the big battle cry for all of these diehards. That's fine. You've released this movie on VHS and DVD and Blu-ray 1,000 times, but it's not the movie I saw in the theater as a kid. You're only releasing the 97 version, which is now edited and has all these nice little fancy special effects added to it. I want to see.
And I refuse to buy this on Blu-ray until they release those originals. And I have a feeling I
think there was a box set. There was a box set that came out, and it did have the original theatrical version, but it's not cleaned up. It's not cleaned up. It's not, where this stuff is put on Blu-ray. Even if you're not going to add stuff to it, you see the process they go in to clean up these negatives because this stuff deteriorates over time. There's a reason that we have a giant vault in the Yucca Mountains where they take 10 or 15 movies a year that they deem worthy of saving and put these reels of tape deep into a mountain to keep them from deteriorating. And this is one of them. That's their $5 club.
Picture of Aquaman at the cave door.
Yeah, leave that outside, please.
I think you got.
So let's go back to 77 and just how hungry the world was for anything Star Wars once this movie came out. And Mike, you had mentioned that you had seen it numerous times over the summer. I was reading that there's up to 60 theaters across the U.S. just played it continuously for a year. And as a matter of fact, a commemorative 1-year
Poster.
birthday poster was sent out to those theaters in recognition.
And it's a highly coveted.
I'm sure it is.
collectible.
Yes.
And it's highly bootlegged as well. So,
and people kept going to see it even after.
But it wasn't like, I mean, now a movie comes out, we review it, and then 3 weeks later it's out on digital, and then 2 weeks later it's out on disc, and then it's on Netflix now. I can watch it all I want. You didn't have that. It was years before this even showed up on HBO.
This is true, yes. So that's why movies like this were continuously coming back out in theaters. So to give people the chance to go see them again. Star Wars came out not just 77, but in 78, 79, 81, and 82.
82.
Even before long before the 97 re-release. So whenever a new movie would come out, like Empire Strikes Back or Return of the Jedi, they would put Star Wars out again, so people could refamiliarize themselves with it.
But there definitely is an entire generation who never got to see that in the theater. My wife's nephews, when the 97 came out, they were still in high school, and we broke them out of school, and I took them to the Ziegfeld in Manhattan, and we saw the 97 because they had never seen Star Wars, let alone on the big screen.
And what did they think of it?
They were pretty impressed, I think. If you watch this movie now, it's dated a little bit. I mean, that whole first 40 minutes, it's all told from the droid's point of view, and it's very slow and plotting. It really is. Now kids are so used to everything in their face, and everything is, just...
Right. But in 77, this was kind of seen as a very fast-paced film, and this is what set it apart from other action films. Because if you think about it, you had the big moneymakers up until that point. Well, obviously Jaws, kind of in a class by itself. But you had the James Bond movies, which traded action with very slow and plotting exposition. Planet of the Apes, more serious sci-fi.
Yeah.
This was just a fun movie, and it really hit all the different types of audiences that you would want to get into the theater to see this. Kids identified with Luke. The women wanted to come see Harrison Ford.
Oh, I thought you were going to say Chewbacca.
I wasn't going to say Chewbacca. Little girls had Princess Leia to identify with.
And she was no damsel in distress, that's for sure.
No, and I think it just was, right place, right time. Amazing special effects for the budget that they had. It was a surprisingly low budget.
They were forced to be very creative with the limited budget they had.
And you were talking about THX 1138, and I think George was listening to the critics that said that was too heavy of a sci-fi movie. He wanted to make something that was more optimistic, and he certainly did. He certainly got that out.
Yeah, and I think our age between the 6 and the 10, that's the sweet spot.
Yeah. And
I think that's the problem when the prequels came out, is that we grew up, but the movies really didn't. They weren't made for 25-year-olds. I mean, we could lavish in this now because it affected us as kids. But now when these other movies come out, you're like, this is crap. Because he's not talking to you.
And I think this original review from Roger Ebert sums it up. He called it an out-of-body experience. And it really is. It's a movie that you can step into and get lost in. And you can't really say that for the prequels or these new J.J. Abrams.
No,
I cannot picture an 8-year-old or 10-year-old losing themselves in the world of episode 1,
Well, but there are. I mean, I hate to say it, you guys have seen my studio. I've got toys and all kinds of Star Wars memorabilia. And I had some of my son's friends came in one day, and they're oohing and ahhing and wondering why they can't open packages. And he goes, "Who's that?" And he points to this action figure. And I'm like, that's Han Solo. He goes, "Oh, I like Obi-Wan." And I'm like, get out of here. This is like Obi-Wan. Yeah.
So let's talk about some of the spin-offs and merchandise that Star Wars spawned. Right away, we had Hardware Wars. Does anybody remember that?
Yeah, of course. No. I have it on VHS.
Jeepers, what is it, Augie Ben Doggy? Did you feel a great disturbance in the Force? As if millions of voices cried out in terror and were suddenly silenced?
No, just a little headache.
It was a spoof of Star Wars, but with all household appliances instead of spaceships.
Yeah.
And I think it was only maybe 10 or 15 minutes long, right? It was a short.
Yeah.
And they would often show it in between movies on HBO when they used to show that type of thing.
Probably the first official fan film of Star Wars.
Then we had Splinter of the Mind's Eye not too long after.
Oh, dude. I'm telling you, I lost my mind. So again, like you said, there was all these merchandising tie-ins. So you walk down the aisle grocery store with your mom, and there's Dixie cups. You can get a free poster if you buy 5 Dixie cup boxes. All with the Star Wars logo with characters on them. I want that poster. I'm waiting in line in the grocery store. And this bookshelf had to have been 25 feet away. And it was so iconic, the Darth Vader silhouette with the Luke and Leia facing him, their backs were to the camera, so to say. And I spotted that novel, and I think it was like $1.75 back then, which might as well have been $20 to a 10-year-old kid. And I begged my mother to buy that book for me because there really wasn't anything else. I mean, the Marvel comics came out, but I didn't even realize that they continued making comics after the movie adaptation.
No, it was the first six. It was the first 6 issues that was the movie.
Correct, right. They made up the movie, and then they had the big treasury versions of the first 6 issues, the second 6 issues, and then there was a big treasury that had all 6 or whatever. I mean, I'm sorry, first 3 and then the second 3. So they, Marvel jumped on this pretty early. And what was cool about the Marvel comics was the fact that they were basically working with the script and just a handful of reference shots. So there's stuff in the comics that were cut out of the movie, especially the biggest being Luke's interaction with his friend Biggs on Tatooine. Like now I still have people who say, I saw that in the theater. And I'm like, no, you didn't. It was never, you probably saw it in the comic book. You saw it in the trading card, but it never existed.
That may have been in the novelization as well, which was...
Oh, I'm sure it was. Yeah,
it
absolutely.
was credited to Lucas, but actually ghostwritten by Alan Dean Foster.
Who actually wrote Splinter of the Mind's Eye.
Now, is Splinter of the Mind's Eye, is that canon, or is that just a divergent story?
Well, any of that stuff that came on afterwards was canon for years. Bantam, all these... I have novels that Luke and Leia had twins, and all these... Luke got married to Mara Jade, who's was the Emperor's right-hand man, and all this other stuff. And then when Disney bought them, they're like, yeah, none of that stuff happened. But they're now going out of their way. And that was the cool thing with Solo, which was Solo, they went out of their way to kind of bring some of that stuff that was fan fiction back then, or what Lucasfilm. There was somebody who actually at one point controlled all of that, so that there was a kind of a continuity in the narrative to it.
Oh, like an editor or something?
Yeah, basically. There was somebody in charge at Lucasfilm that actually monitored and made sure that if this guy over here is writing a novel and he brings in a kyber crystal, that he doesn't call it something else. Or so that it kind of lined up. And that was what made a lot of these fans mad, that for 20 plus years, that was all you had after Return of the Jedi came out. And so that was your lore. They told you this is canon, and then Disney said no. But they did go out of their way in Solo, and even now in Rebels and some of the other Splinter storylines are bringing some of these things back in and making them canon, which is kind of cool.
So what's also interesting about this is the comic book was actually released before the movie.
Yeah, they really jumped on it. I have one. They baggied them. There were little baggies of the first 3 issues, and they were reprints back in the day.
Yeah, the Whitmans.
Yeah. But they had the old school Star Wars logo. The W is like pointed. It's not the W we know from the logo. So little variations thereof. We talk about that Star Wars #1 on a newsstand. There was no comic book stores back then. You go to your local little 7-Eleven and a little
7-Eleven,
spindle.
I was going to say.
And everybody pulls the front book down so
they can see what's behind it. Yep.
So it breaks the spine. So it's hard to find these in mint condition. But there's a very rare 35-cent version that's out there, and it's a holy grail.
Yeah. And Jim Shooter was quoted as saying that Star Wars saved Marvel in the late 70s. And up to a point, it's probably true.
Probably. And they were smart about it, too, because, I mean, up to that point, I think my comic book collection consisted of Bugs Bunny and Roadrunner comics. It wasn't like I knew who the Hulk was. I mean, you did know who the Hulk was. You know who these characters were, but I wasn't reading the comics. And what Marvel did was they just loaded up these books with in-house ads for all their other characters. So all of a sudden you open a page and here's Doctor Strange with, Silver Surfer and Captain America and, the Fantastic Four. And you're just like, wow, these are cool. They did open up a whole new market to probably potential readers who didn't know who those characters were.
So, Mike, do you remember what your first pieces of Star Wars merchandise were?
Yeah, so it was, what was the name of the store? The name of the store was Reed's, which doesn't exist any longer at all.
All of our stores that we bought them from.
No.
And my mom worked there, and we found out that they were there. So I called up, and she brought back Luke and Darth Vader were the first, what were they, Mego or Kenner figures?
Kenner.
The big with Kenner. Well, the Kenner. Yeah. The original 3 3/4 inch.
And I remember that Christmas of '77, a friend of mine had the empty box, and I was completely jealous of that. Wow. He got those figures. He got the 12, I think, that came out for, and I'm sure he doesn't have them anymore.
Well, the piece of cardboard's worth a pretty penny because everybody got the coupon out and mailed it.
Bracket than we are if he still had them. I never had it until the following year. I remember one of the first things I had was a ray gun replica. I think it was a stormtrooper gun. And if you press the button, it said from the film,
There's one. Set for stun.
Oh, really? Yeah, okay. Cool. I had the little video. It was like a cassette cartridge that you put up to your eye, and you could see like little scenes. It was like maybe 12 seconds worth of scenes. The trading cards were big.
Yeah.
You were, yes, with the bubble gum and the one sticker, yeah.
Yeah, and you had to complete those 66 cards, and if you flipped them over, you could make a nice big poster.
Yeah.
So the action figures came later, but I do remember my friend Kevin. He was into it as much as I was, and his Han Solo was different than mine. His Han Solo had a big head, mine had a small head, and we used to have these arguments over whose was better. He also had the Kenner exclusive canteen that was a piece of cardboard, but it came with the exclusive action figures. And one of them was Snaggletooth. Now, Snaggletooth, we know, is this little tiny guy, but Kenner was working off like a still photo, and they didn't know any better, and they made him a full-size 3 3/4 in a blue suit. Immediately was, they realized they reissued him the way we all know him now with the little red outfit, and he's like half that size. And that blue Snaggletooth is worth a ton of change.
Anybody have the 12-inch figures?
I have all 12.
You have all 12.
My original, I had the Jawa, which my aunt got me for my birthday one year. R2-3PO, and then I bought Darth Vader. All the other ones I've acquired over the years. A couple years ago, I finally got Princess Leia, and my kids were like, I was all excited when it came in because I bought it on eBay. Kids were like, "You bought a doll?" And I'm like, "It's not a doll. It's an action. No, it's a doll. It comes with a brush." But her hair was intact, which is really hard to find when it's been used. So, but yes, I have all 12 of them.
I only had Chewbacca from the original. I had Boba Fett for The Empire Strikes Back line for the 12-inch. But
I do have Boba. His head is mutilated. His head has fallen off numerous times. But you could look behind. You could look there's a little eye scope in the back of his eye.
Yeah, like Steve Austin, $6 million.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
Too bad they didn't make a firing rocket on that. Oh, they did. I think he used to have a firing rocket. There's a rope attached to it.
There is a rope. You could it wouldn't fire, but you could take off the rocket.
You could take it out. Yeah.
Yes.
So
let's go back. Memorable scenes for all of us in the original Star Wars.
Chewie in the cantina. I was like, wow. Immediately, now I'm just completely blown away and just sitting there with my mouth open for the rest of the movie.
It's a Wookiee. Yeah. The great thing with this movie is they just thrust you into it. They don't take the time to explain anything that you're seeing. You don't know who's who. You're not given any kind of point of reference.
Yes, the first thing you see is C-3PO amazingly being not hit by this barrage of laser.
Right. Did you hear that? They closed down the main reactor.
Yeah.
Like I said, the swing across the chasm was really stuck with me the first time I saw it in the theater.
Sand people for me, as I said before, but I always wondered whatever kept the Sand people from just attacking everybody. Ben Kenobi. Why wouldn't they just attack him en masse in the middle of the night, just like anybody else that lived out in the desert? What would keep the Sand people from doing that?
What motivates any Sand people? Who knows?
Right. But you're right, Jeff. You're exposed to so much, right, without a ton of explanation, and you just move on, right? Yeah. There's like the Force, you get a little explanation, and now there's a Death Star. Yeah. It's just crazy.
And that's part of the out of body experience. You're in for the ride as soon as this thing starts, and you're part of it. It just takes you along. It's like you're not even a spectator. You're part of it.
Yeah, I will say the one other scene that really sticks with me is right after what Mike was talking about when they're in the cantina and Luke, R2 and 3PO and Obi-Wan Kenobi first go into landing bay and you see the Millennium Falcon and it is a full-on built ship. And it's just, that to me has always been such an iconic, the ship itself you're just absolutely in love with. And when I finally make my way to this Disneyland that they're building down their Star Wars land, I'm going to lose my mind. That to physically see this thing, to walk on the entrance ramp.
Will you uncontrollably weep right there?
I'm going to weep right now, to be
Soil
honest.
Yourself, weep. All your excretions will come out of you at once.
I will tell you, though, Kevin Smith was invited on set of The Force Awakens by J.J. Abrams, and he tells this story of going onto the set, and when he comes around the corner, and they meticulously rebuilt the entire Falcon. It is very emotional, and this is what makes you realize just how impactful this movie was to us as kids. Kevin Smith's obviously a couple years older than us, but still, it just leaves this indelible mark. as he's walking up the entrance ramp, he's like, I take one step and I'm that 12-year-old kid again, you know. Now I take another step and now I'm like 7 years old. Like, it just transports you. It's very moving. It's silly to say that a movie has that kind of impact on your life, but it really did. And like I said, for the longest time, I used to get, not that I was embarrassed, because I wear my nerd colors loud and proud, and I always have. Nerd! But to realize that it affected all these other people, to the point where it's not even a novelty anymore. You know, you almost feel like you're one of the masses, and you're like, right. I'm just going to keep my mouth shut, because you can't put it into words. Like I said, it hit me at a very specific time in my life when I needed something to latch onto.
Because it was perfectly done. I mean, even in that scene, I mean, you kind of get the grittiness of like space travel, whereas like all sci-fi before that was like kind of clean and austere and cold. And now you're into something, well, this looks like a ship that's been in battle. It's been
cobbled together, you know. It's been, you know, that was always my issue with Star Trek Voyagers. They're shunt halfway across the universe. This thing breaks down, and yet they're somehow able to find parts. If I drove my car over to Europe, I'd be forced to put crap pieces on it. It should come back looking like it was all beat up and built from 50 different type of alien ships. But
yeah, and wear a wetsuit.
Okay, so now let's really get into the subject of the 1997 reissue. If we want to just air some grievances about some specific things in there, of course, I would like to start with the inclusion of Jabba the Hutt.
Yes.
Necessary?
No.
Absolutely not.
Right here, Jabba. Been waiting for you.
I think that scene should have stayed on the cutting room floor.
Right. And it was. They did shoot it with a human actor. With a human actor, McDermott, I think his name was. Big, heavy, overweight. He kind of looked like a Gamorrean guard if you look at what he was wearing.
Yes.
Compared to, it was redundant because you'd already established that Han Solo owed Jabba the Hutt money with the Greedo scene.
Right.
So it really didn't add anything to it. And they threw it in there. It was like the dawn of the whole CG character leading into episode 1. So they probably were knee deep in trying to create what we now know as Jar Jar. And they were like, we can do this. We can do this. And they did it, and it was a novelty, but threw in Boba Fett for no other reason than to look at camera and be like, hey, how you doing? How you doing? So
unnecessary and unconvincing. Like you were just saying, it's already set up with the Greedo scene that he owes Jabba money. And it kind of diminishes the threat of Jabba that he lets him go at the end of that little scene.
Yeah.
And just the fact that Harrison Ford, his eye line, you can tell he's not looking at this thing that they've.
And they had to go out of their way to lift him up to make it look like he's stepping on.
And that's so terrible. Like, I grimaced when I just saw it again yesterday for this episode. It's terrible. It's terrible. There are some scenes that they added that are very impressive.
Go ahead.
The Jawa transport, for one.
Yeah.
When they show the full body of that transport, it looks entirely convincing. Completely
nice sunset going down behind it. You got nice color going on. I will say my favorite addition to all three of them that they went back and monkeyed with is the aerial shot of the Falcon lifting out of the docking bay.
Yes.
It's just a completely realized, and it doesn't just lift off like a normal ship. You know, it's like, I mean, he's rocking back and forth as these guys are shooting at him. And that is my all-time favorite addition to this movie.
Anything where it's like a living being that they've added is really, I don't think, hits the mark at all. When they're trying to add in dewbacks and other creatures on Tatooine, it doesn't quite.
And like I said, that kind of diminishes, it takes away from the ingenuity of the guys at the time who were trying to create something from nothing. And so go to the end battle, which was all done with miniatures and models and whatever, and that's fine. So now you have the fluid motion, and you can have all the ships look nice, and they cut left and right and fancier explosions, but you're now negating all that work that was done that made that movie what it was. It doesn't matter how slow and plotting it was. That was the movie.
Right.
Just because you can doesn't mean you should. It's comparable to Da Vinci. You know, here's the Mona Lisa. It's been hanging on the wall for years. And then all of a sudden he comes in and he's like, he goes, I always wanted to put a tree right here or do something. And he changes it. And it's like, but once it's out, and it's not just yours anymore. It's ours. And we own it just as much as you do, in the sense that we made it what it was. You made the movie, but we're the ones who embraced it.
Correct.
Stop monkeying with it.
Have you ever met anyone who saw the original and liked the re-release better?
I'm sure that there are people out there. I'm sure people.
I was just going to say there are people that actually, it wouldn't surprise me. There are people that prefer the running zombie Dawn of the Dead to the classic Dawn of the Dead. And that burns me to no end.
Well, that goes back to my story of these kids who were more entrenched in the prequels. But again, they came out probably the same age that we were when Star Wars came. They're a little more fast-paced. There's a lot more eye candy going on in the sense that these kids have grown up with this stuff. Just go back to Aquaman. It is just a CG fest. It is just, I mean, and there's some nice things about it, but that's what these kids are used to now.
Yeah.
You know, it's not, don't tell me about the monster. Show me the monster.
Right.
You know, the inclusion of Biggs back in there is great. I do remember like people cheering when they had there's a longer cut of him running into Biggs again.
And now, was I hearing correctly, or was the fat pilot, was his name Porkins?
It was Porkins. Yeah, they went out of their way to kind of, it's like, come on. Yeah. Pull up, I can't, I'm too fat.
Get that banana out of your mouth, Porkins. Come on, pull up.
He just had a drumstick in his hand. I will say
also, I never really thought about this before, but going back to that right pre-Jabba scene in that they added to Star Wars, when that spy with the anteater snout, that's very Spy versus Spy-esque.
He looks very much Spy versus
Mad
Spy.
Magazine Spy versus Spy.
Right?
Yeah.
I will say, and this is nothing I picked up on as a kid, but that opening sequence when they capture Princess Leia and they're marching her toward Darth Vader. She's got some perky breasts going on there. They're just, and she has a British accent, which is pretty funny.
Yes. Well, have you ever seen those beachside photos of her in the Turn of the Jedi bikini from?
Oh, absolutely.
From the Rolling Stone shoot.
Yeah.
All evidence points right at those photos right there. No pun intended. So, legacy of Star Wars. Of course, it inspired countless other science fiction movies. Some terrible that came out immediately following the success of Star Wars.
Are we talking Battlestar Galactica?
We're talking like Buck Rogers, Battlestar Galactica. We're talking, was it
Battle Beyond the Stars?
That's the one I was thinking of.
Battle of the Planets was G-Force.
And this Star Wars and Jaws before it really ushered in the blockbuster era of the early 80s. So every movie you really got a film that you could lose yourself in pretty consistently from Star Wars. And you had Superman after that. You had Alien,
78, yeah.
Empire, Raiders of the Lost Ark. All these great movies, one after the other, were coming out year after year.
We were in the dawn of modern cinema, man.
Yeah. And it kind of ended, I think, with Back to the Future. I think after 85.
85, you think?
Stopped seeing that.
We should talk about Back to the Future.
We should.
I think we will. So then, we can't forget Spaceballs in a Star Wars discussion. Yeah.
Well, so then go back to, we talked about this before, which was you really didn't have, outside of like the merchandise, you had no content to really absorb. Splinter of the Mind's Eye. So when the holiday special came out, somewhere along the line, Lucas thought this was a great idea. I was hooked. I'm like, yeah, more Star Wars on TV outside of the making of Star Wars, which was an hour special on television. That was it. As bad as it was, because
the public was hungry for all things Star Wars.
Yeah. I mean, we were chasing everything, right? You mentioned Buck Rogers. You're watching that because you're chasing the lightning, right?
Yeah.
You want to experience Star Wars again and Battlestar Galactica. None of it measured up.
But I loved Galactica because it was about as close as you were going to get.
Yeah.
Really, there wasn't really nothing.
Well, it took them, 30 years to get it right with the most recent version of it?
On Sci-Fi.
Yeah.
Yeah. But again, that's just such a down and gritty version of it. It's brilliant. It really is brilliant. But, I mean, you really didn't have much else to kind of latch onto.
Really, we deserve to give George Lucas a tip of the hat for giving us the original to begin with, Star Wars. So rightfully, it takes its place at the top of our 5 bucket list here at TMI.
Yes, indeed.
Any closing thoughts before we close out?
I challenge anybody to say otherwise. Really,
yeah, it is. It
really
is a cliche, but it has.
It is a cliche. It is a cliche. Like I said, to even sit here and say that this movie changed my life. There's too many people out there now that have the same story. But as a kid, that was my world. I'll stick. I don't watch it very often, to be honest with you. I just jokingly said we should talk about Back to the Future. I will watch Back to the Future every time it's on. I do not watch. I actually watch Star Wars very sparingly, and I did not turn my kids onto it until well into their early teens. But now I've got my niece and my nephews completely entrenched.
Yep. Generation after generation, we'll discover it. And I think if this were a documentary, we could cut to Luke looking at the binary sunset right now. Dun, 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 dun.
Luke, do you want more blue milk? No, Aunt Beru.
So happy New Year again, everybody.
There you go. Happy New Year.
Thank you for joining us on our first bucket list episode. So what are we concentrating on next week? Which film we're going to do another 5 bucket.
Well, Jeff mentioned one I think we all like.
The holiday special? What? Oh, yeah, no. Back to the Future.
All right, then.
All right.
So,
grab your time machine.
Board for that, yeah.
On board.
So
Hoverboard.
if you're listening to this at the end of January, you don't need a time machine. You can just hit play on Back to the Future.
There you go. They'll all be out there for you.
It's all there already. All right, so gentlemen, until next week.
May the Lord be with you.
Sock, 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 sock.